Hey there folks, welcome to video number 18, this one on World War II Part 2. This is the follow-up to video 17 about World War II Part 1 that focused on the military. With this episode, we're going to focus on what was going on in the United States during the war and the impact it had on what is known as the home front. So let's get started. So the United States had to gear up for war pretty quickly once they entered World War II. In the late 1930s, though, leading up to World War II, there were big arguments between interventionists, people who wanted to get involved in the war, and isolationists, people who wanted to stay out of it. One of the most well-known groups that wanted to stay out of the war was called the America First Committee, and they pushed for staying out of Europe and their conflicts. But after the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, any resistance to the war effort was quickly shut down, and while there were people who pushed back against the United States involvement, they didn't get much attention. So the United States was fighting a two-front war. We were fighting in Europe and we were fighting in Asia, and to do this required a very large military and lots of resources. Now you had over 5 million men who volunteered to serve in the military, and the draft, the peacetime draft that had begun before the United States was in the war, expanded, and this added 10 million more men to the military. Women also served in the military, not in combat roles, but in other roles, through something known as the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, or the WAC. And this was later shortened to just 1A, but still pronounced the same, the WAC. And you had over 350,000 who served in non-combat roles like drivers, pilots, they were nurses, they were engineers, doing all these things that are so critical for armies to succeed. And here's a kind of flyer that you would have seen around cities and around towns encouraging people to enlist in various parts of the military, including the Coast Guard. Coast Guard is one of our most important military branches. And here's some black women who served in the WAC, in the Women's Army Corps. And here's an image of one of these women at work as an engineer, checking on the motor of a Jeep that would be used for transport. The economy of the United States also drastically changed during the war. Industries, all major industries, had to convert from whatever they were producing to produce wartime goods: ships, tanks, jeeps, planes, munitions, ammunition, and weapons. These industries employed over 18 million people. 6 million of these were women, and 2 million of them were minorities. Unemployment, which was so high during the Great Depression, it dropped to 1% by 1944. And factories often worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Not the employees themselves. They would work some pretty long shifts, but the factories would basically never close. Wages went up too. Wages went up by 10%. And you had millions of people, 1 million people, who moved from rural areas to the cities for these jobs, to work in these industries. Farmers also returned to prosperity. Their crop production rose by 50%. Their income tripled because of demand for their products. And flyers like this, one of the most famous, featuring a figure known as Rosie the Riveter, encouraged women to apply and to get these jobs. A riveter is somebody who basically screws in these giant screws into planes and into ships to hold them together, and it requires a lot of strength because the guns used to screw these rivets in are very heavy. And here's an image of someone like a Rosie the Riveter welding together. It looks like it could be either a ship, could be part of a tank, or part of a plane. And here they are at work. Notice the line after line after line of planes being produced. And you see women at work on one of those planes alongside men. And here's another factory that was producing tanks. Notice how many tanks there are. So the government is obviously going to get involved in controlling things on the home front. The government is pushing for economic stability and for revenue to help pay for all of these things. You had the Office of Price Administration, which would fight inflation by maintaining prices and rationing food. The War Production Board rationed goods and organized drives for scrap goods. The National War Labor Board limited wage increases so that people weren't getting paid too much and can control inflation. They oversaw any union matters, any union disputes, and they also limited the right of workers to strike because they couldn't risk having any strikes during such a time as this. The income tax increased for almost everyone. Of course, people were making more money, so paying income tax was not quite as horrific as it had been during the Great Depression. But the government still needed more money, so they would issue war bonds that people could buy and then get a promise of return on their investment from the government within a certain amount of time. Here's a poster you would have seen to encourage people to buy war bonds to invest in the war effort. And here's a poster encouraging folks to rationing everything from coffee to the use of metal to the types of food that you would eat to rubber, so that the military would have enough of all these supplies in order to keep fighting. And as I mentioned before, scrap rubber. Rubber could be used to produce gas masks, life rafts, planes, and tanks and jeeps. So African Americans played a very special role in World War II. You had over 1 million who enlisted in the military, and it's important to remember the United States military was still segregated at this point. And just as in World War I, African Americans were often kept out of combat intentionally. However, they did serve with distinction in World War II. Certain units like the Tuskegee Airmen, or officially known as the 99th Pursuit Squadron, fought bravely and valiantly. You had the 92nd Infantry Division, that were nicknamed the Buffaloes, that fought in very important and key battles in Europe. On the home front, though, they were fighting to get a share of the economic upturn from the war. And part of this effort was led by a guy named A. Philip Randolph, who was the leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, one of the first colored unions, one of the first unions to represent the demands of African Americans who worked in the train industries. And they planned a march on Washington in 1941 to protest discrimination in hiring. And President Roosevelt pleaded with them to not march. So Roosevelt, under this pressure, issued Executive Order 9981, and this prohibited racial discrimination in hiring for the defense industry. So if your company wanted to produce goods for the government, for the military, you could not discriminate against workers because of their race. This ultimately resulted in 30% of African Americans were employed in skilled jobs. You had another group, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, led by James Farmer, that fought against segregation in northern cities and in the factories there. Now, obviously things were not peaceful and running smoothly. You had a major race riot break out in Detroit in 1943 that showed the tension that existed between whites and the growing black population in cities like Detroit and Chicago and even places like New York. Here's a photo of some of the Tuskegee Airmen hanging out on one of their planes. Here's another photo that would encourage African Americans to buy war bonds. And this is A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph was a pioneer in the civil rights movement. So he had planned a March on Washington in 1941, and he also helped for the March on Washington that took place in 1963. He was a very important advisor to Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders of that era. Without him, a lot of the civil rights movement would not have taken place. And here's James Farmer, the leader of CORE, who pushed to end segregation in jobs and in residences and in all aspects of life in northern cities. And here's a photo from the Detroit race riot of 1943. Notice you have these white men pulling a black man off one of the rail cars. It was an incredibly violent riot that, again, reflected the tension as more and more African Americans moved into cities for good jobs and to get away from the Jim Crow and segregation of the South. So other minorities in World War II. Mexican Americans served valiantly in World War II. Over 300,000 enlisted in the war effort. 17 of them earned the Congressional Medal of Honor. And millions also worked on farms in the Southwest and California, helping produce all the food that was needed for the U.S. military. And of course, there was tension between whites and Mexicans competing for jobs, in addition to just plain old racism. And this racism popped up in what were known as the Zoot Suit riots in LA in 1943, where you had widespread fighting between whites and Mexican Americans. They were called the Zoot Suit riots because zoot suits were a type of outfit that were favored by many Mexican Americans, many of whom were making good money because of the jobs in the war industry, in the war economy. And they kind of showed off by dressing up in these suits. These were very baggy suits, and you'll see a photo of it in just a minute. Native Americans also served. In fact, 25,000 enlisted, and this is a higher ratio than any other group in the military. The Navajo in particular served as code talkers in the Pacific, so they would transmit messages by radio, and they would speak in their own language. And this was better than using a secret language or codes, because the Japanese couldn't translate Navajo. They didn't have anybody who could translate Navajo, and so they could never break the quote-unquote code that the Navajo were using. One of the most famous Native Americans to serve was Ira Hayes. He helped raise the American flag on the island of Iwo Jima, a very famous image that was captured by a photographer at that battle. Here's a poster calling for Mexican Americans and Hispanics to support the war effort. Here's a photo of another young man in a zoot suit. Note the man on the right. That outfit he's wearing is what the baggy suit is what was known as a zoot suit. And here are some of the Navajos using their own language to communicate messages on the battlefront. Asian Americans in World War II also served valiantly. With the Chinese Americans, you had 13,000 who enlisted. With Japanese Americans, it was a little bit trickier, though. Many of them were treated suspiciously after the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. And just a few months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Executive Order 9066 forced the relocation of Japanese Americans who lived on the West Coast as a military precaution. And they were placed in internment camps in the western United States. Many of them pushed back against this, though, and in one court case, in Korematsu versus United States in 1944, one of them actually challenged that it was a violation of his constitutional rights. The guy's name was Fred Korematsu, who was born and raised in the United States. However, the Supreme Court ruled against him and argued that Executive Order 9066 was actually constitutional as a military order. So 110,000 Japanese Americans were placed in camps in the Southwest. 2/3 of those placed in these camps were Nisei, which means they were born in the United States. They were American citizens. 33,000 of the men actually enlisted in the U.S. military to get out of the camps and to prove they were loyal to the United States. One of the most famous was the 100th Battalion that fought in Europe. They were known as the Purple Heart Battalion because so many of the men earned the Purple Heart, which is an award for being being wounded in service to your country. And they eventually merged with the 442nd Regimental Combat Unit, and this is the most decorated unit in United States history. They won more military awards than any other unit. So in 1988, Congress actually apologized for the internment of Japanese Americans, and they awarded all survivors $20,000 each for this experience. And here's some photos from this time. You would see outside, this was in Chinatown, and you see they would have posted signs saying, "I am an American," making it clear that they supported the United States. Here's a copy of orders that folks would have seen on the West Coast, ordering them to pack up and basically meet at a certain place and time. This one was in San Francisco, California. Here's an image at one of the internment camps. Notice that the folks in it, that they're smiling, but nevertheless, their civil liberties were basically gone. They were done away with during the war just because of a suspicion. No actual evidence of any Japanese Americans enjoying being part of a plot. And here's President Bill Clinton actually with Fred Korematsu awarding him the Presidential Medal of Freedom back in the 1990s and recognizing his efforts to end the Japanese American internment, even though the Supreme Court had ruled against Korematsu. So, at the end of the war, there was a lot of talk about what to do with the GIs, with all these soldiers who had served, who would be coming back to the United States. So Congress passed something known as the GI Bill of Rights, and this would provide new opportunities for veterans. It would provide them money for education, for job training, for housing, for businesses if they wanted to start one. If they were a farmer, it would provide them money for their farms. And it would basically help veterans ease back into civilian life while also easing the economic shift from wartime to peacetime production, which can usually be pretty turbulent and pretty difficult. This would also fuel something known as the baby boom, when you had these soldiers coming home and wanting to start families and reuniting with their loved ones. And, starting a family, having quite a few babies. More babies would be born in that time period following World War II than any other time so far in American history. And this would lead to the growth of the suburbs in the United States in the 1950s. So here's a political cartoon showing all the options that veterans had with the GI Bill of Rights. And here's a poster that they would have seen, which would encourage veterans to go back to school and use the money given to them by the government. And the GI Bill still exists today. That's why if any of you know somebody in the military who's gone to college and the military's paid for it, this bill does exist and has changed in some ways, but it still allows a lot of opportunities for those who have served in the military. Well, thanks for watching this all too brief history of World War II. We'll be doing some exercise. We'll be doing some projects in class focusing on the use of the atomic bomb and the Japanese internment.